to go? Good evening and welcome to tonight's study session of the Boulder City Council. I am Council Member Nicole Spear. Thank you for joining us. We have on tonight's agenda 2 items. Our first item will be the Boulder Junction Phase 2 update. And our second item is the Community Culture Resilience and Safety Tax, CCRS, Nonprofit Support Program, review of the grant criteria. There was a third item inadvertently listed on the agenda for tonight titled Discussion on Proposed Rules Regarding Council Participation at Board and Commission Meetings. This item was removed prior to Monday's Council Agenda Committee meeting and should not have been listed on tonight's agenda. This item will be rescheduled for a future meeting after Council's summer recess. We apologize for any confusion this may have caused. We'll start the meeting this evening with an announcement. The 2023 Boards and Commissions mid-year recruitment period is now open from May 29th to July 2nd, 2023. We are accepting applications for the following board or commission: Beverage Licensing Authority, Boulder Junction Access District Parking, Boulder Junction Access District Travel Demand Management, Downtown Management Commission, Landmarks Board, and University Hill Commercial Area Management Commission. You may find board and commission descriptions and vacancies online at www.bouldercolorado.gov/boards-commissions. If you have any questions or need assistance, please contact the City Clerk's office at cityclerksoffice@bouldercolorado.gov or call 303-441-4222. Before we go into our work items, I will take a moment to outline how the meeting will be conducted. We will review staff's presentations for each of the items or subsections of each item, and then we will have a time for questions. At the end of each presentation and questions period, we will conduct our council discussion with staff. If you have any questions, please wait for staff to complete their presentation, and please save any comments for after our question periods. I'll now turn to our city manager, Nuria Rivera-Vandermeide, to introduce our first item.
Thank you so much, Council Member, and I'm excited to hear and have staff present a little bit more on this really cross-departmental work that's been happening on Boulder Junction. And with that, I'll ask KJ, I think you're going to kick us off, and if you could introduce yourself and the team as you go forward, that'd be great.
I will do that. Hello, City Council. Thank you for having us here this evening. I'm Christopher Johnson. I'm the Comprehensive Planning Manager with Planning and Development Services. Joined here by my colleagues in PNDS, Chris Ranglos and Vivian Castro-Woldridge. We also have Rachel Shinman and Daniel Guiban from EPS. They are our economic and market study consultants, and they'll be available for questions. And also Rachel will be doing part of our presentation to give City Council an update on some of the preliminary market trends that we have uncovered as part of this project. So let me share my screen briefly. And hopefully you are now seeing the presentation. Great, I'm seeing a thumbs up. Excellent. So as Nuria mentioned, we are here to provide you an update on the Boulder Junction Phase 2 project. This is one of City Council's priorities. And we have been really underway since the beginning of the year and have offered a couple of more text updates and through an information packet earlier in the year. So we are excited to be here to speak to you directly and get some feedback on some alternatives and really direction for a preferred alternative. So really quickly, just in terms of overview, we are going to provide a brief project overview. We do have a lot to cover tonight, so we're going to move fairly quickly through the slides. We can always pull those back up and go back to them, but hopefully you've had a chance to review the memo that includes much of this information. But we'll start with a quick project overview. We'll go into what we've heard through our community engagement process, and then also have an opportunity for Rachel to share some insights into the preliminary market analysis. At that point, we'll take a very brief break to just see if there's any questions from the group, and then we'll move into our 3 topics and key questions. So what we are here to speak about this evening is the Transit Village Area Plan, and really an amendment to the Transit Village Area Plan. So the area is now relatively known as Boulder Junction, and that's how we've been referring to it. The Transit Village Area Plan was completed back in 2007. It guides future development within this particular area. And back at the end of last year, in late 2022, there was council direction to move forward with amending the plan, really to update it to where we are here 15 years later, and do that prior to moving forward with any significant implementation steps. So before we would change any land uses or rezonings or look at any infrastructure phasing, we wanted to basically revisit the area plan. And one clarification I just want to make, and something we've been keeping in mind as staff team moving forward through this process, is that really this is an opportunity for us to just make some very strategic updates to the plan. We are not reinventing the wheel or really starting from scratch. There's a lot of really great information and policy guidance that's in the original plan, and so we're really holding on to a lot of that, probably 85%, and just making some very key and strategic updates as we move forward. We're focusing in on three particular areas and topic matters for the amendments going forward. So we are evaluating and looking at potential amendments to the Transportation Connections Plan, the land use that is described within the plan, and then finally the urban design and character for the Phase 2 area. And so we will cover those three items tonight and have a key question for you to discuss as we move forward. A couple of thoughts to just really set the table in terms of some considerations and opportunities in Phase 2 that staff has certainly been thinking about and have come up as part of our community engagement feedback we've been hearing. And also, I think it's important for council to keep this in mind as well, that this is a bit of a different animal than the Phase 1 area, which was on the west side of the railroad tracks. A lot of that area was open parking lots and vacant lands from the original Pollard Motor site and other kind of large-scale open and vacant areas. This is totally different. Here we have multiple properties, multiple owners, a lot of existing structures. There's very few vacant areas within the Phase 2 zone. There's a very vibrant local business community that's on site. There's also not any developable city-owned property. If you remember back on the Phase 1 side, the city owned a large amount of acreage that ultimately then partnered with affordable housing developers and others to bring those projects forward. But here, really the only city-owned property is the area along Goose Creek that serves as storm and floodwater management, and also some park and open space multi-use paths and that type of thing. We anticipate and really expect that this is going to be a fairly incremental change over time. And so we are trying to think about the character of this area and how it can react to the market in the future and respond to a lot of intermediate conditions. So it's not all going to change overnight. It's going to be, I think, a very more sort of progressive and incremental change over time that's going to happen piece by piece as opposed to large scale redevelopment. The other benefit that we have as staff is that we recognize that there was a 3-year process to work through the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan, which was recently adopted last year, and offers a lot of very relevant policies and a planning framework that we can apply here. The character of this area in terms of its existing uses and what the future may hold there's a lot of similarities there with the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan. So again, we're drawing upon that for some inspiration as we move forward. So the key questions for you this evening are going to be around those 3 topic areas. So does council agree with the possible changes to the transportation connections? Does council agree with the potential land use changes that are being considered? And then finally, do you agree with the proposed approach to using place types and the approach to public spaces to better define the urban design and character of the outcomes that may ultimately happen here through redevelopment? So with that, I am going to pass it off to Vivian to talk about what we have heard from the community through this process.
Thank you, KJ, and good evening, council members. I'm Vivian. I'm the engagement lead for this project, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you how and what we heard through the process about Phase 1 and hopes for Phase 2. And you'll see later in the presentation how this feedback is reflected in the guiding principles that underlie the team's work. Next slide. So we've made numerous channels available to make sure we're hearing from broad and diverse voices in the community, and at the same time ensuring we hear from those who will be highly impacted. We have 4 focus groups with a total of 67 members, and we're very appreciative of their time and thoughtfulness in providing feedback. We've met twice virtually and had 2 site tours with focus group members. And members include people who live or work in or near Boulder Junction. They include phase 1 and phase 2 property and business owners. They include representatives of various advocacy topics, and they also include the development community. And the project team is also being supported by 2 community connectors, one who lives at 30 Pearl and the other lives directly adjacent. And the connectors continue to provide advice and additional outreach, and they also participate in the focus groups. We've had 2 open houses and online questionnaires as well to provide options for the broader public to participate. And to ensure that property owners and businesses in the phase 2 area were aware of the project and could provide input, we've sent mailings and emails explaining all the various engagement opportunities and communication channels, and organized a site tour specifically targeting property and business owners. And we've also been collaborating with representatives of other departments in the city. Next slide. As Noria mentioned, the project covers subject matter that spans several of our boards and commissions, and I wanted to highlight that this project is piloting a multi-board working group, and the overarching purpose is to ensure that we have an efficient mechanism to share information with and seek input from all interested boards, but to do this without having to meet individually with each one. We had our first meeting at the end of May, and the next meeting is scheduled for July. And we've already received some initial feedback. For example, for transportation, the working group highlighted the importance of traffic calming measures on roads such as Pearl Parkway for a pleasant pedestrian experience, in addition to adding more connections in the area. There was also some discussion and a hope expressed in the first meeting that perhaps with greater densities and activity here, it would make a commuter rail option more viable. In terms of land use, there were comments about how greater flexibility of land uses will help the area evolve over time in response to demands and opportunities, and could lead to more interesting character. And in terms of public space, as the city doesn't own any developable land in the phase 2 area, there was some concern about how to make privately owned public spaces a success. Next slide, please. So these are some pictures of our 2 open houses. We had over 40 people attend the first one and over 60 people attend the second one. Next slide, please. And now I'll share an overview of what we heard. So I'll start with the feedback on how the phase 1 area has developed. We heard from many people that despite the challenges that we all know about with the halted RTD services, people did appreciate the longer term vision of the transit-oriented design with its mix of residential types offered at a range of prices, and the mixed land uses, and the well-connected mobility network and improved walkability. In terms of dislikes, we heard that the architecture felt flat, and across the board, we heard the desire for more green public space and tree canopy throughout phase 1. So more places to gather and connect, and for kids to play. Lots of people also expressed that the phase 1 area is missing a unifying character, a sense of place, and can feel like anywhere USA. Next slide, please. We also asked what people's hopes are for phase 2. We heard quite a bit about the fear or disappointment at the prospect of losing a beloved business that currently serves as a community gathering space, and the desire to keep these types of businesses here as the area transitions, and generally ensuring that smaller businesses would be able to thrive here because it makes for a more interesting or social neighborhood and community. Like we heard for the phase 1 area, we heard about the importance of providing additional green spaces and public spaces in phase 2, together with more housing in a mixed use environment. We also heard the desire for an attraction that would contribute to Boulder Junction's identity and a sense of community and be a draw. And the idea of a gateway also came up quite a bit. The community felt that with its location next to foothills and adjacent to East Boulder, we should have some urban design elements that make it feel special, like this is Boulder Junction, and that would help with the transition from a more industrial East Boulder into other parts of Boulder. We heard that phase 2 should have a better defined character that reflects Boulder, and we'll need to explore that a bit more, but characteristics that were highlighted to us were the outdoors and innovation spirit. We heard support for additional transportation connections by foot, bike, and car to make it easier and safer to get around. And finally, we heard that we should ensure the area is well connected to adjacent neighborhoods and amenities like Valmont Community Park. Next slide, please. This is my last slide about engagement, but I wanted to be sure to highlight tonight that there's other issues we have heard and we acknowledge are of high priority or concern to our community. Even though we may not be able to address them partially or fully through the plan amendment, we're keeping them on our radar for this next phase, where the mechanisms will be explored to address such concerns. We've already started conversations with other relevant departments, such as Community Vitality, for example, to discuss how this issue of retaining and encouraging small businesses as the area develops could be tackled, and with the recognition that these businesses are social assets. We heard feedback from phase 1 that the retail and commercial spaces are spread out and that it would be better for both placemaking and business viability to cluster retail in a few strategic locations, and the team will explore this. We heard over and over again that residents in Boulder Junction would like more spaces to gather, including kid-friendly spaces, and even the idea of a dog park was and how important these amenities are, especially in a denser neighborhood, in denser neighborhoods with multifamily housing. We heard that concerted efforts are needed to ensure that the area is not a concrete jungle. And finally, we need to plan ahead for all the features that would make the future rail station a complete and functional station. So we'll carry forward that feedback into this next phase of the project. Thank you. That concludes my overview of what we heard, and I'll now pass over to Chris and can take any questions on engagement when we pause later. Thanks.
Thanks, Vivian. Actually, we're going to go to Rachel quickly to provide a quick overview of our market analysis.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to do a very, very quick market overview, and we'll have lots of time for questions. But as Christopher said in the introduction, I am Rachel Shinman. I'm a vice president with economic and planning systems, and Dan Guimond, a senior principal in our office, is on the call as well for the conversation. We're based in Denver. We're a land economics consulting firm. You can see what we do there, but we have done a lot of work in the region, in Boulder specifically, and actually on the TVAP plan back in 2007. So it's been exciting for us. I wasn't here back then, but Dan worked on it to see how it has built out and now to get to take another look at it. So on the next slide, you'll see the framework of the analysis that we're doing. So this is one component of the broader study right now. But what we're really looking at is those initial land uses that were proposed in the original plan, and do those still align with the market? And if not, what changes might be needed? So today we're doing a very high level look. And as we move through the process, we're doing more detailed analysis specifically within this area to really understand how the market has changed since 2007, and what changes that might mean for this area. And so you'll see throughout this study, we're looking at industrial, flex, office, retail, and multifamily as the core land uses, and the market characteristics of those. And the outcome is understanding what changes to the land uses might be needed. And then also, as we look at implementation, what some gaps might be in terms of implementing the types of development that the community wants to see, and what tools and strategies and policies might be able to address those. So on the next slide, there's a whole lot of words, but this is a high-level overview of market trends in these 4 areas citywide. And so in general, the key takeaways are that multifamily has been by far the strongest asset class in the city since 2010. Industrial is interesting because there's been a net loss of space, but rents have increased and vacancies have decreased. But the industrial market has become a little bit more regional, where we're seeing larger industrial users migrate out of the city to where there's cheaper, larger pieces of land to get the types of development that they're looking for. And so an adaptation of industrial space within the city. And then retail has sort of followed the larger, broader retail trends over the last 10, 15 years. And so less new development and slowing rent growth. And then office is really interesting to us right now because we're still working out what the impacts of COVID are. So rents are still high, particularly in downtown, as we'll see in phase 1 area, but vacancies are also very high. And so we're still looking at what that means for the future. So on the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk through these specific areas for the Boulder Junction area as it relates to the city. And so with industrial, the key takeaways are that vacancy is very low, rents are high, and the share of the city's inventory is high. But also we've been seeing this net decrease in space. And so what we might be looking at is sort of an adaptation or repurposing of these industrial spaces as the current users move out. And the space is no longer suitable for a new user because it's outdated. But with land costs and development costs, it's very difficult to build new industrial on that space. And that's potentially a really big opportunity for this area. So on the next slide, we see flex space, which are often combined in market analyses. Sorry, there's a siren going past, if you can hear it. But we've split it out here because especially as we think about industrial mixed use type development, that's often more related to this flex space. And so there's a lot of it currently in the phase 2 area, and performance has been up and down, but it is a key part of this area that we're looking at, and potentially an opportunity moving forward. And then on the next slide, we see office, which has been, you can see the increase in the phase 1 area, which is, as a result of the build out of the plan. And the office in that area is really comparable to office space downtown. And so it's a very strong office market there, but we're also seeing those higher vacancy rates across the board, not unique to this area. And so looking at what that means, and also this has been a growth node for office. So you can see at the bottom that almost a quarter of the growth in citywide office space since 2010 has been in the phase 1 area. And I think that's a testament to the success of the plan. And we'll see that especially in multifamily as well. So on the next slide, in retail, that's probably the weakest sector in this area, just in terms of the metrics. Obviously, there is retail in this area, and it's functioning, but it's not a large portion of the market. And often that's more tied to residential. And so that comes later on after residential is there. And then in this area, it's also a question of what retail is available in surrounding areas and how to access that. So that's potentially an opportunity if and as more new residents are added to have additional retail in this area. But it's not currently really competitive with other retail spaces in the city. And that's something that we've seen sort of across the East Boulder area as well. And then on the last slide, or the second to last slide, the multifamily, this is again, you can see that before 2014, there was no multifamily in this area. And as the plan was implemented, there's a lot of multifamily in this area. And so a third of the city's growth was in the phase 1 area. So that's a huge success. They're also expensive units for the most part because of the nature of new development. But it is a really strong opportunity as we look to phase 2 and how much multifamily was envisioned versus what might be demanded by the market now and how to incorporate that. So on the last slide that I have, just these initial findings. And again, this is the beginning of our work and I went through it faster than I probably ever have. So we'll have time for questions. But again, just emphasizing that the market support for residential really is strong. Retail will likely be tied to the residential, and industrial and office are changing. And so as we look at what we might do within this plan, that's where you've already heard the word flexibility a lot. That's likely to come up more. Just making sure that we have the tools to adapt to some of these market changes while still delivering what the market wants and the community wants. And so as we move through the rest of this process, you can see on the right all the fun stuff that we'll be doing on our end. But that's the super quick market overview.
Thank you, Rachel. That was great. Nicole, I wanted to offer an opportunity to pause here at this moment before we get into the really the key questions and the meat of what we're interested in hearing from council about. So if that makes sense, I can pull down the presentation and just see if anybody has questions.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation. Tara, it looks like, oh, no, you went away. Okay, Lauren or Tara. Did you want Lauren to go first? Okay, Lauren, you're up.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Tara. And thank you for that great presentation. Covered a lot of territory really quickly, and I appreciate that. So one of my questions is about, you talked a little bit about sort of regional industrial and how some of that's, as businesses look for more industrial property, they might be moving away. But what about service industrial? And I was wondering if there were anything from your market analysis that you could share with us on
we
service
haven't,
industrial.
I think the data that Rachel shared so far was mainly more the macro industrial and flex related information. Our next task is to drill down a little closer, looking at the existing business mix that is in the area. And as you alluded to, there's a lot more in the way of service commercial or service industrial uses in that area. So I think we still have some work to do in terms of understanding the dynamics and viability of those businesses, and kind of balancing what may be possible in the way of preserving those uses versus maybe the underlying land demand dynamics, which land values and such that are may result or may be resulting in some of those businesses being turned over as a result of redevelopment.
Thank you. That's it for now for me.
Thank you. Tara.
Yes, in one of the last few slides, when you're going through all the vacancies, there was a slide that said that residential was the strongest, and so we should do residential. But then it said something about multifamily vacancy being higher. Did I read that wrong? It was going pretty fast, so I'm worried that I misunderstood, and I'm wondering if you can explain what you mean by that, or did I incorrectly read that?
No, that's a great question. It is higher in this area, and that's a result of new development still being built. And so that rate captures the lease up process. And so when a building is built, it's empty to start. And so over time, it leases up. And so because the multifamily in phase one is still new and still leasing up, that's a lot of what's baked into that number. That's a great observation.
Is it for the multifamily that's already up? How is the vacancy rates on that? Or do you not know? Or is it detailed and not macro enough?
Yeah, so right now, the data we have is at a macro level. We can dig into that to look at how, the developments that were built in 2014, 2015, and look at, lease up times and things like that. At this point in the process, we just don't have that granularity of the data, but that's something that we can get.
Any more, Tara? Okay, thank you. Mark.
Thanks for that great presentation. My first question was actually asked in its entirety by Lauren, so thank you, Lauren. I'm very concerned about how the service industrial properties are going to be faring in this new world. But you also noted in the multifamily that the rents are 11% higher than elsewhere. And I guess my question is, how is that fitting into our overall goals to provide attainable and affordable housing?
Well, I think the data is primarily, or that we presented anyway, is primarily market rate projects. It probably doesn't reflect the affordable units that are built in the area. I think again, we can, when we drill down into the individual projects, we can provide a better rent profile of the units by type within the phase one, within at least phase one of the plan area.
And just, at beginning when we talked about looking at the market dynamics, but also the implementation considerations. That's one that we definitely anticipate coming up, is when we talk about including residential in this area. We sort of know what it will look like if we just let the market go and build multifamily residential. And so depending on what we really want to see in the area, what tools or other strategies or policies might be needed to ensure that that happens. So that's part of this, is understanding where the market is, and if that's the only type of residential we want to see in this area, or if there's more of a blend and what it would take to get that.
Thanks. I look forward to that analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone before we move on to the rest of the presentation? All right. Thank you. I think we're ready to move on then.
All right, sounds great. Let's see. Make sure you're going to get the right screen. Are you seeing the presentation? Perfect. Okay, great. All right. Thank you, and thanks for those questions. We are now going to turn to the three key questions and the three topic areas that we identified: the transportation connections, the land use choices, and then urban design and character. And we're going to start out with Chris to take us through the transportation component.
Right. Thanks, KJ, and good evening, members of council. My name is Chris Ranglos. I'm a senior planner in comprehensive planning, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about some transportation connection ideas we have, as well as some land use options. Go to the next slide, please. So initial feedback through our community engagement has confirmed that the community feels that there could be improved transportation connections in the area. And given the feedback that you see on the screen, staff has evaluated the transportation connections plan and identified additional connections. Next slide. Before we jump into what we are going to propose, let's just start with some existing conditions, essentially. And so what you see here is the existing road network and multi-use path network in the area. And so the dark, if you look at the map, the dark gray lines here is the existing road network. Wilderness Place, sort of the teardrop road north of Goose Creek, and then we have Old Pearl connecting to Frontier across Pearl Parkway. We see, as I'd mentioned, minimal connections throughout the area, and in many instances, we see evidence of a lot of social trails in the area. And the image that you see to the top is of Goose Creek looking east, and this is a highly used multi-use path in the city connecting many key locations. And the bottom image is of Old Pearl looking east. Next slide. A few more existing conditions, this time from Wilderness Place looking north on the top image, and then Frontier also looking north towards Pearl Parkway on the bottom image. Next slide. Now, what's great is, as KJ had mentioned already, we do already have a connections plan for the area, and everything that you see that is in dashed lines is what is already proposed in the Transit Village Area Plan. And quite frankly, a lot of what we've been hearing from the community is already proposed and supported in the area plan, including key several crossings along the BNSF railroad tracks and over Goose Creek. Next slide. However, we do think that there is opportunity to further refine the connections plan with some minor additions and adjustments. And everything that you now see in yellow on the dashed line are those additions that we'll be proposing. So we'll go through each one of those individually. Next slide. The first is going to be a proposal to extend the proposed multi-use path along the rail tracks all the way up to Valmont. And this connection is originally proposed to begin at Pearl Parkway and end at Star, where the future rail station is considered. And feedback that we've been receiving actually indicates extending this connection all the way up to Valmont should be considered. And you also see an additional connection, pedestrian connection off of this multi-use path connecting it to Wilderness Place. Next slide. The second is to add an additional multi-use path across Goose Creek, increasing the connectivity between the north and southern portions of phase 2. Next slide. We also propose additional local road connections with back alley access, in particular along foothills. This helps form smaller blocks in the area, more conducive to enhancing the pedestrian experience and allows for better building access. Next slide. And the final addition that we're exploring is to extend the already proposed pedestrian path across Goose Creek on the east side of phase 2 up to the proposed multi-use path. This is really a minor addition and is more about filling the gap between the two already proposed connections in the area plan. Next slide. So I think we'll pause here. And the key takeaway for a preferred approach is that there is support from the community to incorporate additional transportation connections into further study and refine them as part of a preferred approach. And our question that we pose to council this evening is, does council agree with the possible changes to the transportation connections? And again, I think we'll pause here and answer any questions and get any feedback that we can from council.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's start with questions, and then we can move into just kind of getting a pulse on where we're at and any comments that folks have. Who has questions? Tara.
Full of questions tonight. So I have a question. I must have missed an email. It's possible. We had so many about the rail, the future rail. And I did my own studying in the past few days, but I just want to confirm with you what exactly you mean by that. Did I miss something big in the news?
I don't know that you missed anything big in the news. KJ, I might let you, or we do have transportation staff available on the call as well, provide maybe an update to City Council on the status of the future rail station, as well as maybe the bus station, because I know that there's probably questions around that too.
Yeah, that's great. I'll defer to Chris Haglund.
Yep. Chris Haglund, Principal Planner, Transportation and Mobility. Good evening, Council. Yes, I can provide some updates on future rail service. So basically, there are two different types of service being studied right now. There is the Northwest Rail Peak Hour Service. That's an RTD study. Right now, they're in the midst of a 2-year or 24-month study to look at providing peak rail service in the Northwest Corridor, which would include train going up to Boulder and then all the way to Longmont. Right now, in terms of a possible start date for that survey, according to RTD, we're looking at perhaps 2030. And that would really just be peak hour service. So a few runs in the morning and a few runs in the evening. However, there's also the Front Range Passenger Rail study that is also happening at this time. This is more of a statewide effort led by CDOT. They received, I think, $2.5 million to study the possibility of creating a front range rail that would essentially connect Pueblo to Fort Collins up to Cheyenne. So that is a different type of service. At this point, there's not a future date of proposed start of that service since they are doing the feasibility study. And if you would like, I could also provide an update on bus service at this time if that's desired.
You could maybe just give us in a couple of sentences, Chris. And
Sure.
also, I just want to clarify, you said, I think I heard the 24-month study is happening now for the Northwest Rail peak hour service. And you mentioned that the survey would start at 2030. And I think it's the service. Okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think a quick update on RTD would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So as you all know, transit service out of the Boulder Junction Station ended in April 2020 as part of their COVID service plan. RTD's 2022 System Optimization Plan, or SOP, calls for the restoration of 2 of the 5 routes that had previously served Boulder Junction. That includes the Flatiron Flyer 4, or the FF4, which goes to the Civic Center, and also the AB2, which would be the airport ride. Right now, we're looking at restoring that service by 2027. Of course, that is all dependent on RTD resources. Mostly they refer to as an operator shortage. There is also an upcoming Boulder County transit plan. And this will really be an opportunity to assess additional transit service options in the Boulder County region through partnerships with the city and Boulder County. So that's also a possibility for getting service a little quicker there. We know we've been trying very hard to get RTD to restore that service.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Matt, you've got a question.
Thanks, Nicole. And Chris, thanks for that update on the RTD and the rail stuff. I think our community's long overdue wanting to see something happen in that regard, and we're not the only ones on the Front Range. So thanks for that. My question centers around the very sort of south end of sort of TVAP 2. I think it was sort of area 3 referenced in the map, and sort of thinking about connectivity out of the south end, you know, towards the Google property, and then ultimately down towards like the grocery store and that stuff down on Arapahoe and 30th. And I'm just sort of thinking that if we are to do housing there, it would certainly pose an awkward jog for people to have to move strictly west or strictly east to then come down to what may be another grocery store other than the Whole Foods or just other services. So I'm just wondering, was there any consideration? I know it deals with the BNSF rail and any sort of crossing over that, but I was just curious what thought was given in, or is that on the table, off the table? But I'm just sort of curious about that southward exit out of what might be a bunch of housing on the area 3 part of TVAP 2.
Matt, are you referring to the crossing that is to the very southern end and crosses the rail on towards Walnut, or towards that direction to the far south?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, as far as my recollection, and as part of the site review process that occurred, I believe last year, that came to City Council, that underpass connection there was essentially removed from part of the plan, or that site plan was, or that site review was approved without that connection. I'd have to double check with Charles and the development review team to get an update on that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I didn't know where the update was on that, but thanks if that was the case. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Bob.
Thanks. This is kind of a follow-on to Matt's question in that same area. I don't know if this is under transportation or under land use, so I'm just gonna ask it now, and if you want to defer it to land use, that's fine. Sure. What is the what's the flood situation here? I know, you know, we're trying to be careful now as new developments come along, not to put housing or actually anything in the 100-year floodplain. What do we have a floodplain map, or do we have some idea of what is and is not in the 100-year floodplain? And if so, are the mitigating steps being taken?
Yes, great question, and then I can offer an update there. So most of that area that's south of Pearl Parkway is within that 100-year floodplain. The primary culprit of that is a very constrained connection right where the North Boulder Farmers Ditch and the Boulder Slough connect, right at the rail line, very close to Pearl Parkway. So if you can imagine on the map, it's basically the far western side of that area, just south of Pearl Parkway. And there, and I just had an opportunity to connect with our utilities department just today, actually, and learned that there is essentially a letter of agreement for city department, utilities, the property owner in that particular area, and the ditch company to work together to come to some solutions about improving that area and essentially getting that property out of the floodplain and improving the drainage there. Also, they will, of course, be looping in with the BNSF railroad, just because all of that is interconnected. And it's a very complicated situation, as you can imagine. Within the original Transit Village Area Plan, there is also a proposed underpass for a multi-use and pedestrian connection there as well. So it's, from what I understand from talking with utilities and transportation and mobility staff, it's not going to be easy. It probably won't be cheap, but it is feasible to make those improvements and actually essentially create a new trestle bridge that would span that whole area and free up some of the water, stormwater issues, and also create a pedestrian connection there.
Well, that's great, Christopher. That really kind of ties back to Matt's point about connectivity to the southwest. There, it would seem we could kill two birds with one stone. Many years ago, Aaron and I served on the Greenways Advisory Board, and I know that we always try to put flood mitigation efforts and bike and ped transit together because they oftentimes go hand in hand. So it seems to me it would be a very elegant solution. I know that we've got a lot of parties involved. So like you mentioned the Ditch Company, Burlington Northern, which I know sometimes is challenging to work with, and property owners and so on and so forth. But I would think that if we could get all the relevant players together and both mitigate that flood risk before we start putting a bunch of houses downstream and at the same time put some connectivity in there, to Matt's point, it seems to me that's a win-win situation. So from my perspective, it seems to me that's something we should really bake into this whole project.
Thanks.
Thanks. And Lauren and Tara, I saw your hands go up, and I'm just going to ask, is this more related to the transportation connections or more to land use kind of stuff? Okay, cool. Lauren.
Thank you. So I know with both of these connections on the south of the site, they've been laid out in the plan as underpass connections. I guess I was wondering if we don't do overpass connections anymore, or if that's a space constraint issue. To me, it feels like the most important thing is to be able to connect both sides. And so I guess I'm just wondering, will you be looking at that both ways if there is a possibility to do an overpass connection, but not an underpass for some reason at one or both of those locations?
Sure. Yeah, I think at this point, all options are on the table to explore. And the area plan as currently written includes some flexibility. I think the preference is for an underpass, but certainly it would allow for an overpass. And in particular, if it was more of a pedestrian overpass, that's a much easier connection to make than any kind of vehicular connection. I will say the one challenge, of course, that presents itself is that overpasses, particularly over commercial rail lines, need to be extraordinarily high. I think they need 25 to 28 foot clearance below them. So it's not an insignificant structure to get something across, but that certainly is an option.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the transit center. The 2-year feasibility study that's being conducted with respect to peak hour rail service. Would I be correct in saying that that's simply a study to determine whether we should actually be studying providing the service? And that it's entirely possible that in a couple of years, we will come back and be told, sorry, there will be no rail service.
I think the vision of the study itself is to determine when service can be provided along the rail corridor, starting with peak hour. So I think that's what the key thing is. It's an incremental bringing on of service of really looking at just at the peak hour at the beginning, and then that laying the foundation for regular, all day type rail service. But that's my understanding, that the assumption is moving forward with it.
But if peak hour were not to be proved feasible, would we then jump to full service or simply say there'll be no service?
I can't say anything for certain on that.
Mind if I chime in, Mark, with a comment? Yeah. Because we talk about this at a lot at the Northwest Mayor and Commissioner Coalition, and also are in regular communications with RTD on this. So I would say nothing is certain about the peak service, right? So that could work out or that could not work out. I think the best chance for the rail service here is in conjunction with the Front Range passenger rail, where you have some local service and you have some long distance service. And there are all kinds of activities going on to make Front Range passenger rail happen right now. Grants from Amtrak and from state level things. And so there are people who are doing a lot of work on that right now. And it's looking promising. And that's probably our best bet.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate the update.
Thanks, Aaron. Did you have a question as well? Okay, thank you. And Tara, I see your hand back up.
And my question was asked and answered.
Perfect. Okay. So heading into this next part, I think what I'm going to do is just ask a general question about agreement with the possible changes to transportation connections and see where folks are at. And if people have anything that they would like to change, a specific thing that they're interested in adding, I will then ask for people to weigh in on that, and then we can have a discussion about any of those changes. Is that general thumbs up? Seem okay? Okay, cool. So raise your hand if you are in general agreement with with the proposed possible changes to transportation connections. Okay, looks like we got almost everybody there. So does anyone have any specific things they would like to propose? Changes, modifications, additions, anything like that? Matt.
I mean, I think it was, for clarity, I think kind of just coming back to what Bob really poked on, and I was kind of too, about just making sure we have good pedestrian or bike egress out of whatever we do in that southern section of TVAP 2 out into the southwest direction. So if that's through the slough or revamp there, or through some other underpass, we need some conduit to get people out of the south end of there. So that's something I'd like to see us do one way or the other.
Great. And then before we go on there, does anybody have any comments specific to Matt's comments? Okay. Who is of similar mind to Matt? Okay, we got everybody there. Okay, thank you. Tara, you're up next.
I did want to double down on what Matt and Bob did say. I believe it was Bob who said it about the flood mitigation situation, not just for transportation, but also for being able to, build residential. And KJ, is that your nickname? You want us to call you KJ?
Yes, yes, either that or Christopher is fine.
Okay, KJ, you said the words not easy, but feasible. But
yes,
wouldn't it be difficult to make residential with the floodplain is the 500-year floodplain? If the floodplain is 100-year floodplain?
Yes, it would be impossible to.
Okay, so
well, not impossible. You can raise it up. Essentially have parking on the ground level, but it makes residential extraordinarily challenging, just again because of our height limits as well. It reduces the number of housing units that can be created, so the financial feasibility of a residential redevelopment in that area would be really challenged.
So if, let's say, residential as housing is one of the most important things that we want, wouldn't but feasible need to be changed to definitely need to have?
Hey, Tara, can we come back to this in the land use part?
Yeah. Oh, I knew I switched over.
I really want to keep us on transportation connections. Thank you. All right. Do you have any questions or points about the transportation connections though, Tara? Okay, thank you. Lauren.
I think I just wanted to emphasize something that Christopher said early in the presentation, which was sort of about a more fine-grained approach to the transportation connections, that generally, I think we're seeking to sort of break down some of these blocks and have sort of the weave of the fabric of this area be like a smaller, tighter weave. And so I guess my just encouragement to continue looking, like there might be additional connections that make sense beyond what is shown. And if that were to happen, I would be in support of those as most likely as well.
Thank you. Can I get a hand raise if you are also in favor of this idea of adding in some more smaller connections, as that seems appropriate as it comes up? Okay, a lot of trust for you all, staff.
Great.
Aaron, or Matt, your hand is up still? Are you okay? Thank you. Aaron.
Super quick, just to plus one, the Southwest connection and the flood importance there, and the appreciation of the finer grain approach. And if you've got a couple more, that'd be interesting. Thanks very much. Appreciate all you're doing.
Thank you. And Mark.
Just a quick question. Are the expensive but feasible infrastructure projects that we're discussing tonight already within the $300 million of unfunded infrastructure needs that we have, or would this be in addition to what we already have?
That is a great question, and I would have to double check with utilities, but to my awareness, any sort of improvements on the Boulder Slough we do not have a mitigation plan. It's not currently in our CIP 6-year plan. As I mentioned, there is a signed letter of agreement between the parties to coordinate on and understand really in more detail what this would entail, and certainly what cost estimates would come out of that. And my assessment, at least at this moment, is that this would not all fall to the city to actually perform. That there would need to be some kind of a public-private partnership in order to do this, because certainly the landowner would benefit tremendously from improvements in this location.
Okay, thank you.
Can I colloquy on that point? I mean, since we're hitting it right now, Nicole, I hope that's okay with you, because I was going to bring it up later, but since we're on it, and maybe this is a question for Joe, and maybe it sort of was already answered to some extent by you, KJ. Are there any resources or is there any council action that we could take that would accelerate or add resources to get to some conclusion? Because as was stated, this seemed like might be very difficult, and we don't have some certainty whether or not it will or won't happen. But whether it happens or not will absolutely impact Area 3 in terms of what we ultimately say we can do, the land use we put in there, and the zoning with regards to any housing feasibility. So the sooner we know the answer to the Boulder Slough, the sooner we can really dictate things, the sooner the developer can. So I'm just wondering, is there anything we can do to accelerate any resources we can provide to get that answer sooner than maybe we otherwise would be on a track to receive?
Would you like me to jump in on that?
That would be great, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Sorry to be joining late here, and I don't have the benefit of the earlier part of the discussion, but understand, and by the way, I'm Joe Tadiucci, the Utilities Director for the city. Understand that you're talking about the Boulder Slough and the potential to reduce the floodplain and maximize housing development, and our utilities team is aware of that desire. And just recently here, I signed an agreement to advance some work with the railroad and some of the ditch companies that are involved out there to support some of the analysis that is needed. So I don't know that there's any council action needed at this moment to accelerate things, and may have to follow up with you after the meeting on the status and the details. But we are aware of the needs and are working forward to support reduction of the floodplain. And then I heard Mark ask a question about whether the funding for project development is within the $300 million, and I think it's $350 million that, and what he's talking about is what we've identified in our flood master plan as the backlog of projects needed across all 16 drainages. I can confirm, but I believe all of the projects across all drainages are part of that 350 million. And I can go back and look at details as the discussion continues and may be able to confirm tonight. So again, without the benefit of the prior discussion, that's what I can share at this time.
That was awesome, Joe. Thanks for answering that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it seems like we're getting very eager to move on to the land use discussion. But Bob, any final transportation connection thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's just this flood mitigation is kind of the convergence between transportation and land use. So thank you for indulging us, Nicole, as we kind of drill into this. Just a couple of questions for Joe. Joe, thanks for that. One is, do you have a back of the envelope estimate on what this would cost? I know there may be some cost sharing between various parties. And then second related question is this the type of project that we might get some funding from the Mile High Flood Risk for? Thanks.
You're on mute, Joe.
Sorry about that. I don't have the cost details. I can look into that while the discussion continues and follow up. And for sure, any of our any of our 16 drainages are subject to us requesting assistance from the Mile High Flood District. So we can look into that as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we can officially move on to the next step, but staff, let us know if you are missing anything, but I think we have general agreement, yes, to this question you posed to us. And we are especially interested in an exit point in that southwest corner, as well as a more fine-grained approach as it comes up and seems relevant.
Great. Thank you very much. Chris, back to you for land use, the fun stuff.
Fun stuff. Okay, great. Thanks. Next slide. Okay, so we'll jump in. The community's preference for land use, similar to transportation, is to also update the proposed land uses in the plan to allow for greater flexibility for many different types of uses, including maximizing our housing opportunity and allowing mixed use throughout. Given that feedback, staff has created 3 land use scenarios using the guiding framework you see on the screen, and we'll go through those. Next slide. The first option that you see on the screen here proposes no change to the TVAP's original proposed land uses. This is our no change option, essentially. And the goal with this is to proceed with the existing plan and introduce a mix of uses to the area while retaining some light industrial and office uses, especially north of Goose Creek. This option also identifies high density residential development along Goose Creek, taking advantage of that as an amenity. This option could potentially yield somewhere between 400 and 600 new residential units, between 2,600 and 2,800 new jobs. Most community members disagreed with only allowing office and light industrial uses in the north and thought that it could be a better location for residential and or mixed use. Next slide. So option 2, taking lessons from the East Boulder subcommunity plan, this option introduces a broad application of mixed use transit-oriented development, or MUTOD, to the area. And this is a new BVCP land use designation that was recently adopted during the East Boulder subcommunity plan and is intended to be located at regional or local mobility hubs and along key transit corridors. The goal with MUTOD and option 2 is to transform existing disparate uses into mixed use transit-oriented neighborhoods rich with amenities and services. This option would introduce a mix of uses to the area while maintaining maximum flexibility to respond to market demand. MUTOD is anticipated to result in primarily attached residential uses with office, retail, service, commercial, and light industrial supporting uses integrated vertically within buildings and horizontally across the area. This option would yield somewhere between 1,000 and 1,300 new dwelling units and roughly the same number for new jobs as well. And most community members agreed with encouraging a residential focused mixed use environment throughout all of phase 2 and liked how flexible this land use category could be. There was also appreciation for how this land use designation could allow the area to adapt to the availability of transit and market needs over time. Next slide. And our final option, option 3, we see MUTOD once again applied north of Goose Creek near the future rail stop. And this would replace the office industrial as was suggested in the original Transit Village area plan. Again, this mixed use designation places emphasis on housing opportunity while also still allowing for a wide variety of supporting uses. Here we also see MUI, or mixed use industrial, applied to the south of Goose Creek. And similar but differing from MUTOD, MUI places emphasis on light industrial uses on ground floors while still allowing for supporting uses such as attached residential, retail, service, office, and commercial. The goal with option 3 is to introduce a mix of uses to the area while maintaining a focus on preserving some light industrial uses. We place emphasis on housing opportunities north of Goose Creek and near the future rail stop in the MUTOD and high density residential designations, while focusing more on a potential mixed use light industrial area south of Goose Creek in the mixed use industrial designations. This option would yield somewhere between 800 and 1,000 new dwelling units and between 1,300 and 1,500 new jobs. And finally, varying feedback was received from the community members on this option. Slightly more respondents disagreed with the idea of splitting the land use designations up rather than having a more consistent land use approach across the entire area. Next slide. So we'll sort of summarize the three options that we have before us, and they all offer varying opportunities to increase residential units and jobs from what exists today. So option one would maintain the existing TVAP plan and would perpetuate office and industrial uses to the north, with housing, light industrial, and mixed uses to the south. This option would yield the least amount of new housing units and the most amount of new jobs. Option two, again, would maximize flexibility and opportunities for residential units and density near transit facilities in the entire area. This option would yield the most amount of housing and the least amount of new jobs. Option three would focus residential units and mixed uses north of Goose Creek and still allow for an increase in residential units and density south of Goose Creek, as well as potentially a greater range of light industrial uses. And this option would yield slightly more jobs than it would housing units. Next slide. So our key takeaways for the preferred approach is allow for greater flexibility for land uses over time in the area, maximize our housing opportunity and mixed use opportunities over the traditional office and industrial, as was proposed in the original area plan. Given community feedback and market uncertainty, there is direction to move away from TVAP's original proposed land uses. And staff is recommending, based on feedback and analysis, exploring option two further to establish flexibility for the current and future uses. And the question we pose to council this evening is, does council agree with the potential land use changes being considered?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Let's open this up for questions first, and then we can get to comments and talking through the different options. And Bob, I saw your hand go up. Tara, I know you had a question that I made you carry over to here, so I just want to see if you would like to address that question first.
So nice. It's actually a new question, so Bob can go first.
Okay, thanks. Bob.
Thanks, Tara. Just a technical question for KJ. You talked about jobs. Are those incremental jobs under each of those options, incremental to what jobs are there now, or is that just total jobs, including what's already there?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is an estimation of total jobs based on some, the assumptions that we would make that go into our model based on the different land use categories. So it's not an incremental addition to what's there today. It's just a capture and an estimate of what an overall job profile might look like.
Okay, so but that for housing it was incremental, but for jobs it's not incremental. Is that how we should read those sliders?
Actually, both are an estimate of the overall number, not incremental.
But there's very little housing there right now.
There's zero housing there. Correct.
So yeah. It is all incremental. Then.
Yeah. So I guess you're correct. Yes, on the housing side it would be incremental, but in terms of jobs, yeah, that would be an absolute overall number.
Right, and then just back to the envelope, how many jobs are there right now? It's just if we wanted to back out and figure out if we could do apples to apples on increments, both housing and jobs. How many jobs are there now? So when you say 1,000 to 1,300 or whatever those ranges were, that's compared to like what? Do we have 500 jobs there now? 1,000 jobs there now? Just what's the baseline?
Yeah, it's a great question. Based on the data that we have for the entire phase 2 area, it's in the neighborhood of about 16 to 1,800 jobs total.
Okay, thanks, KJ.
Yep.
Me?
More, Bob? Yes, you're up, Tara.
So I'm glad that we have this new mixed use TOD. I have a question for you guys. If this is the fact that it's a transit oriented development, is that because we have the possible but not definite train coming, or is it other transit? Not that I mean, let's be honest that we put this whole, TVAP 1 was all about the train that, stopped coming, and not only the train not come, but the buses even stopped coming. So I guess my second question is, if it is all about the train, then is there an option to be flexible enough that if there is not going to be any train, that we don't have everything kind of, centered around a train? You know what I mean? Yes. Or is this not even a good question? Because if it doesn't even make sense, don't go there.
No, it's a great question. So the short answer is no. It's not directly linked to the train. It is linked to sufficient and ideally rapid transit that is offered. So, for example, the MUTOD land use category, was created through the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan and was applied for the first time at 55th and Arapahoe, where there is a bus rapid transit facility that's being studied and hopefully will be built soon along that Arapahoe corridor. So it's not specific to train necessarily, but certainly would benefit from and is essentially linked to the anticipation or existence of significant transit facilities being there and being available.
Thank you. Lauren.
Thanks. So when I think of land use versus zoning, I usually think, the land use is kind of the bigger, broader brushstroke tool, and then you kind of dial in and get more specific with the zoning for what's allowed and not allowed.
Right.
I appreciate that the MUTOD is more flexible. Are there any things that we wouldn't be able to do in that zoning that in that land use that the other land use types would allow? Like, is it just that we're, by assigning all of it in that category, that we really are leaving ourselves open for flexibility, or are we cutting off particular directions by doing that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it raises it's something we as staff have been thinking about and kind of wrestling with, in that by applying MUTOD across a very large area, it does open the door to essentially the most flexibility that we would have, and that flexibility comes in the uses that would be appropriate in those areas. The intensity of development, so the scale and height of development that could occur there. Again, you're not required to build 4 or even 5 stories, but certainly the possibility would be there. It also can be refined somewhat, and I think to your description of the land use category is spot on, in that it's the broad brush stroke. MUTOD is the most flexible of our land use categories that we have available to us. Where we start to refine that is through, and we'll touch on this actually a little bit later this evening, is there's the notion of place types that can be applied essentially to overlay the land use, that start to refine a little bit more about the types of uses that would occur there, the performance expectations, the feel of those places. And then ultimately through zoning or even application of the form-based code, we can further refine, the character of those physical built outcomes. But to your question about, are there things that would not be appropriate or not be allowed within the MUTOD that might be allowed in some of the others? The only thing that really jumps to mind is more of a true industrial type of function, where I could see that being appropriate within that mixed use industrial or even the office industrial proposal from the original TBAP. It would likely not be an appropriate land use within MUTOD.
And that would be more of a heavier industrial, or are
Correct.
you thinking light industrial as well?
No, more on the heavier industrial side. So light industrial, service commercial, those kinds of things that have come up already in the discussion. And certainly those have come up in our conversations with the community and with property owners. Those would all still continue to be allowed within MUTOD. So what staff appreciates about option 2 is that it allows for all of the businesses and the uses that exist there today to continue forward, and it offers an opportunity for those to be established again in the future in different locations, or for other things to happen as well.
Thank you. That's great. I'm so excited to hear that. Also, just one more clarifying question. Along with that, there was a 3 to 5 story height sort of, I think, suggested with that. Is that tied to that land use? I usually think of heights as being tied to zoning. So maybe you could, is that something we need to apply at this point, or is that something that we could maybe have tied to the zoning and have that for more of a later discussion?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely part of a later discussion. What we're intending to do by including some of that information in the presentation and in our descriptions with the community is just to try to give everybody a kind of a sense of what could happen there. Certainly, we can get into a lot more detail as we move through a zoning process or a rezoning process to identify, are there areas that might be more appropriate for that 4 or even 5-story, type of development versus areas that might be more appropriate at a 3-story level?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thanks. Rachel.
I think my question is maybe the inverse of Lauren's first question. But if I followed everything correctly, our office space use or inventory has increased 71% over about the last decade. At the same time, we've lost a lot of industrial and flex, or we've lost some of it, especially compared to outlying towns, surrounding towns. So under MUTOD, might we get more office or predominantly office with this flex zoning? I would think at some point the market would say, especially with vacant, we don't want it, but there must be some reason that we keep building offices. I assume it's lucrative or beneficial in some way. So if we use this, can we say, some amount really should not be more offices that we don't need more of, or is that coming zoning, or are we safe there?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. So as we'll touch base on, there are some place types that, again, this is a planning framework that was used within East Boulder. And there are some place types that don't allow for office, but they do allow for this integration of light industrial, retail, that type of thing, and residential. The other, I would say also certainly within if there are to be rezonings in the future, that is something that we can look at. And really that will be driven by the market as well. And I don't know, Rachel, if you're still on, if you have anything to add to that, but certainly I think that there are tools and mechanisms we can put in place to guide, I won't say guide the market, but certainly guide some of the outcomes in the direction of the uses that we're interested in, and perhaps away from, pure office uses.
Oh,
Yeah, I might just
pure office uses, like, percentage wise.
Sorry. What was the question, Rachel?
Oh, I was just saying, maybe there could be some pure office, but not a high percentage of it, like, a low volume of it, given that we have so much right now. And sorry, I cut someone off there.
No, I was just going to add that there's, and this is related to sort of both of the last few questions, there's trade-offs with flexibility. And Dan could probably speak this a little bit too, is that if there's so much flexibility in that you can build any of these uses, go do what you want, we're going to see what the market is strongest in, and only that typically. And so if there's a desire for more than just say, and I can't tell the future, unfortunately, I keep trying, but let's say it's just multifamily, if that's where the market is, and there's a desire for more than just multifamily housing in this area, even if the others are allowed, that's where we get into those other layers of how do we better shape what comes in. And so different mixes, ensuring that there's some sort of flexibility to allow for the market dynamics to play out, but even some form of, non-residential use that allows for whether it's market or office or light industrial or flex or retail, but ensures that there's some level of shaping there, just to get that bookend to the flexibility.
And when do we need to look at that? I assume it's not tonight.
Yes, I would say that's not tonight. So just as far as quick overview, and we'll cover this in next steps at the very end, but really what we're talking about tonight and where we will ultimately be coming back to you, ideally in September, is for an amendment to the Transit Village Area Plan that will establish these high-level policies. The next phase of the project is to move into that those implementation steps where we will hone in, much more in much more detail on rezoning strategies, again, possible form-based code updates, and how we can shape the things that are actually built in and what those outcomes look like.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you, Rachel. Mark.
In a zoning category where almost everything is permitted, on what theory would a developer ever choose to maintain light industrial uses?
It's a great question, and I think that it kind of gets to the crux of what the evolution is going to look like, I think, in the phase 2 area, and how that might be different than what occurred in phase 1. As I mentioned, there's a very vibrant existing business community that works here, and some of those businesses, some of those individuals own their buildings and own their properties, and may not have a whole lot of reason to redevelop in the future, or at least for a period of time, because their business may operate, profitably, and they're comfortable where they are, and they want to continue to be in the community. There's also, scenarios where those properties are owned by others and lease that space to profitable businesses. And again, there needs to be enough of a financial incentive to go through the long and complicated process that we have here, in Boulder, to redevelop a property into something else. So I think there are many cases of existing businesses that are there today that will continue for a considerable amount of time before, redevelopment pressures may change that.
But ultimately, would you not agree that in the end, all of those businesses are gone, and that entire light industrial neighborhood that currently exists will be gone because it will always be more financially profitable to build other forms of development, such as housing?
I don't take maybe quite as dire of a look at it, because I do think that there is an interest in the community, and if there is residential here, the residents that are going to be living in that area to have access to those types of services and businesses. And there, even if a business may change or move, really what we're hoping to be able to offer and provide is the flexibility for a future mixed-use building to come forward and offer some of those same types of uses on the ground floor, with perhaps residential above. So there may be, the structure may change, the building may change, but the goal is for a lot of those types of uses to be maintained. And I know our community vitalities department is working on a number of ways to be able to support existing businesses, and actually in particular support businesses that are going through these periods of transition and change, where they maybe move to a different location within the city, but also looking for ways to help support the new spaces that are created to make those affordable to future businesses going forward.
And have we identified any such areas where we would be relocating our light industrial?
Well, as I understand, and I don't know if Chris is on the call tonight or not. Oh, I do see his name there. He certainly could speak to this maybe a little bit more. But as I understand, there's a fairly informal process right now where Community Vitality helps to find and essentially connect businesses with property owners that have space available. And that's certainly one thing that we are trying to formalize and become more intentional about. And Chris, if you want to add to that.
Thank you, KJ. Good evening, everyone. Chris Jones, Director of Community Vitality. So just to speak to what KJ was mentioning around the work that we are looking at when it comes to affordable commercial and making sure that spaces remain available for the types of businesses that we want to see able to stay within the Boulder Junction area. We're going to be having a conversation with Council on August 10th regarding our affordable commercial pilot program. But having said that, Councilman Wallach, I think you were asking where light industrial land uses may be preserved in the city. And I don't know that that is related to the work that we're pursuing as far as making sure that spaces are still available for the types of businesses that we want to see in these areas that are redeveloping.
I'm merely suggesting that what we're presenting as a series of choices will not really be a series of choices, that the service industrial will be eliminated one way or another, and those properties will be turned to a higher and more profitable use. That's simply the nature of the development business.
Can I colloquy on that when you're sorry?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just want to clarify, right now, we're talking about the land use. We could still, in the future, when we're looking at zoning, select zoning districts that are not nearly as permissive. Like we could, for instance, assign zoning that requires light industrial. Is that true?
That is true. I'd have to go back and look to see if there are form-based code or zoning districts that would actually require light industrial, but certainly we can use those tools and use those regulations to potentially guide or limit the types of uses that would be available or that would be permissible within certain areas.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. That's my question.
Thank you. Tara.
KJ, was there outreach to the businesses, the landlords, tenants in that area, and how did they feel about the three options?
Yes, absolutely. And Vivian and Chris, please chime in on this. But I know that we have one of our 4 focus groups is specifically made up of property and business owners in the phase 2 area. We've also hosted a site tour with those groups and had a lot of response to these alternatives as part of our second round of focus group meetings a couple of weeks ago. And the general perspective that that staff has received from the business community and the property owners is that they are very interested in the flexibility. They certainly do have, I would say, similar concerns to what Councilman Wallach raised, and are interested in staying there. But also we've heard that under the current Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan land use category that applies in this area, and the zoning that applies in this area, there's actually some property owners that would like to have certain types of tenants, and have had offers to bring those tenants in, but they're not able to do it under the current regime. So there certainly is an interest overall to look for some additional flexibility. And Vivian, please chime in if there was anything else there.
No, you covered what I was going to say. Thanks, KJ.
Anything else, Tara? Okay, Bob.
Thanks, KJ. Just kind of following up on the discussion that you had with Mark and with Lauren about jobs and light industrial and whatnot. If I understood your chart right, even under option 2, which is the least number of jobs, you're still talking 1,000 to 1,300, 1,100 to 1,300 jobs. I know that's not incremental. That's roughly what we have there now, maybe slightly less than what we have there now. I get the fact that not every job is equal. In other words, a light industrial job may be different than a retail job or a restaurant job. But I think I just want to make sure that I understood your point in answer to Lauren's question. There is still potential for when we eventually get to zoning here. We're just talking about land use now. We could zone it for things that are job creating, whether that's or job preserving, whether that's light industrial or retail or office or any other types of jobs. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. The MUTOD land use category allows for the greatest range of zoning assumptions that we could make underneath that.
Great. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone. This has been a really substantive discussion. I appreciate everybody staying really focused on the topic, and we're also exhausted from our 90 minutes that was allocated. So, but thank you. I think the comments have been helpful. Okay, so now I just want to go through kind of a similar thing to what we did with the transportation connections. I'm just going to ask generally for each option, who is in support of that option, and then we can talk a little bit more about any finer grained distinctions that we would like to make tonight, recognizing that future council will have a chance to come back to some specific zoning types of conversations too. So let's start with option 1. Is there anybody who is in favor of option 1? Okay, we've got one for option 1. How about option 2? And again, just general category. Okay, it looks like 8, if I counted correctly. Okay, so option 2, and I'm just going to ask it for consistency, option 3. Okay, so it sounds like option 2 is the direction that most of us are interested in going into. And so what I would like to do is just open up conversation around any specific things we would like to tweak about this option at this stage. Lauren.
So I'm cheating a little bit. It's not something that I want to tweak at this stage, but as you move forward with this and we start looking at zoning, I share a lot of Mark's concerns. And if there are areas where we can do something to preserve our service industrial or make that, depending on what our market analysis shows, more feasible for people, I would be interested in that.
Thank you. Can I just ask for a show of hands of who is also interested in Lauren's suggestion? We got mostly yes, so one in the middle. We'll say mostly yes. Thanks, Lauren. Aaron.
Yeah, I think you all are on the right track here, and I just want to offer a couple of comments, just kind of following up on some of the questions that people are asking, and just in terms of like the transit-oriented nature. Well, in general, like when this plan is implemented, it's going to take a long time to go into effect. Like properties will redevelop incrementally, slowly over a pretty long period of time. So I don't think we're going to see like a large scale vanishing of existing uses. Some of them buildings are really new. They're not going to go away anytime soon. So I want to make sure that we keep in mind the benefit of additional housing, in the long term, as we're moving to zoning, because I think even if our zoning is focused primarily on housing, it's not like that entire area is just going to redevelop in 3 or 4 years. I think it'll take decades, I'm sure. And while it does, I'll just mention, I think the transit will be coming back. We're getting more service to Boulder Junction before too long. And while we've been focusing on what exactly has been going into that transit station, there are other bus lines that stop very nearby, like the Hop is nearby, the Flex route to Fort Collins is nearby. And we are working on the bus rapid transit to Longmont along 119 that will go very close to this area. And then I think we'll expect to see RTD to come back gradually. And there's that solid potential for the front range passenger rail as we look into more of the like 8 to 10 year timeframe. So I'm fully in support of the mixed use option 2. And I just want to be careful that we don't dilute that because of concerns about where we are exactly today, because I think the long-term trends will head in the direction that the land use plan is going to be going in. Thanks very much.
Thanks for those additional comments, Aaron. And I just wanted to offer just the additional comment. I mentioned to everybody about the mitigation action plan that is probably going to kick in a few years to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions along the Front Range. One of the things that I really like about this is that it does kind of get us staying ahead on on having our land already doing some of the mitigation action plan steps, which will help us out in a few years if those restrictions on transportation funding start to come in. So really appreciate it for that as well. Okay, and KJ, was there anything else you wanted to add before we move on to this last question?
No, I would love to just move on, just because I know we're stretching our 90 minutes a little bit longer. So I appreciate everybody's time and patience.
Okay, great. Then I'm just going to ask the general question again. Does council agree with the proposed approach to place types and public spaces to better define urban design and character? Just a yes or no to that very general question, then we can move on. Raise your hand if you agree. Okay, looks like everybody there. Almost everyone. Okay. Anything specific that anyone would like to add or offer comment on about this? Going once, going twice. All right, staff, do you have everything that you need from us?
I do. I would offer just a very quick slide on next steps if that would be useful. So give me just a moment.
Thank you.
I'll get to that. So as we've been talking, this is really great and useful information for us. So we will be heading back and pencils down here for a while through the month of June to develop our preferred approach. Through the month of July, we're going to be gathering feedback then on that preferred approach. We've got a number of engagement activities, another round of focus meetings with our focus groups. We're going to provide an update to Planning Board towards the end of July after all of you are back, both Planning Board and City Council are back from your break over the summer. We are hoping to be able to provide you with an IP around that same time towards the end of July, just to provide you with an update of where we've landed for a preferred approach. It may come as a heads up or something. We'll see how much time we have. We are going to have another meeting of the multi-board working group. So we're going to gather all those liaisons from our different boards and review that with them. And then we're also going to make the draft amendment to the plan available to the public for public review for about 2 weeks towards the end of July. Before we put any final refinements to that, head to Planning Board in August, ideally, and then back to you in the third week of September for a public hearing on amendments to the plan. And also our hope is to go ahead and bring forward the updates to the BBC land use map as well and run those concurrently. So that's our goal, and really appreciate all of the time. This was really great.
Great. Thank you so much, KJ. And thank you to everyone else who came in to give us all this great information. It was really a robust discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
And Nuria, would you like to introduce the second item?
That would be great. And thank you. Great. Thank you so much, Councilmember Spear. And I just want to say, really thank all of you. That was a really great conversation, super productive feedback, and excited to hear some of your thoughts as the team continues to move forward. So appreciate that. Our next item is one that many of you have heard in the past. We've had presentations. I'm going to go directly to Mark Wolf to talk about some updates on grant fundings. And we have a new grants manager with us. So be nice because it's her first time with us.
Thank you. And I just want to remind folks, I think I may have forgotten to do this reminder earlier. Can you please introduce yourself as you start talking? Thank you.
Good evening, Council. Just getting the slides situated here. All right, everybody see that okay? All right, so good evening. I'm Mark Wolf. I'm Budget Officer for the city. Happy to be with you again to discuss the Community Culture, Resilience, and Safety Tax, specifically our nonprofit grant program. We will be reviewing grant criteria. This is in follow-up to our last touch point with Council on the CCRS grant program back in October of last year, where we discussed the overall program framework. So we've been hard at work developing a program, filling out that program structure, developing specific criteria, which we'll review this evening. So I'll take you through a very brief history. Many of you are very familiar with the history of CCRS, formerly CCS. We'll just touch on some of that just for context. Briefly touch on an overview of the program structure itself, and then I'll turn over to Tony, who will describe the criteria in a bit more detail. We'll then shift over to some additional program information and pause for questions and discussion. So normally we don't get into the management structure per se, but we thought it would be helpful context given that the grants function is a new function in the city. certainly related to our efforts to continue to strive for efficiency in how we deliver internal services. We created a new division within the finance department to help support citywide grant activities. We are really excited to have both Tony Townsend, who you'll hear from in a moment, as our grant senior program manager, and Annie Scott, who has been with us about 10 days now, so we're not going to make her present this evening, but really excited. They both come with a whole bunch of great experience and will be valuable members to the team. How we hope to support citywide grants activities, a focus will be on supporting organizational strategy and capacity and obtaining federal, state, and other grant resources, and also administering the CCRS program. So thought it would be helpful just to set that context a bit in how we'll be performing the tasks. In looking at the history, so again, voters approved the renewal of CCRS back in November of 2021. This was a 0.3 dedicated sales and use tax, primarily for infrastructure investment. The ballot language did a few things. Most importantly for our discussion this evening, it created 10% of the tax revenues, up to 10% of the tax revenues, to fund a grant pool for nonprofit organization projects that serve the people of Boulder. So what that means in terms of projected revenue is about $21.75 million over the life of the tax. That's 10%. And then about $1.5 million annually. So we can either look at that annually or over the life of the tax, depending on the flexibility we need within the program. We formed an internal steering committee in January of last year to help explore grant structures that were based off of focus group input from both the lead up to the tax renewal and also subsequent engagements that we did in 2022. Within that, the lead up to the renewal of the tax and developing the ballot language in 2021, and also the engagement that we conducted in 2022, helped create a series of goals and intended outcomes for this nonprofit support program, specifically looking at advancing our racial equity goals and outcomes, addressing critical deficiencies, improving infrastructure, and advancing Boulder's vision of being an inclusive and welcoming community, maintaining a healthy, stable, and financially sustainable nonprofit base within Boulder to provide services to the community, leveraging investment in public dollars wherever possible, and then addressing infrastructure needs, specifically to ensure community viability and resilience while preventing higher costs in the future. We conducted two focus group sessions, first in the lead up to the CCRS tax extension in 2021. We received input from 19 nonprofit organizations, including a couple of previous CCS grantees. A number of items were pointed out, specifically the need to support planning grants, not just construction costs, that a combination of transformational investments and smaller capital projects should be considered, that they should have broad reach and support of the entire community, that we enhance the flexibility in grant administration and ensure a transparent decision-making process. We then conducted focus group sessions in March and April of 22, a little bit more focused on small to medium nonprofit organizations. We had 15 representatives from 12 nonprofit organizations. The feedback helped confirm the program goals that we went over and lead us to the structures that were shared out last fall. The feedback we put in 3 different categories related a lot to the accessibility of the grant program itself and some of the barriers that were present in accessing CCS dollars of the past, and what might be needed in order to make sure that any resources were accessible to a variety of organizations. We also heard about the desire to have collaboration opportunities with city staff, but also with other organizations, and looking at opportunities to partnership either in space or providing service, and that there should be value in participating in the grant process itself. Going through an extensive application can be prohibitive for a lot of small organizations. And so we heard the need to provide flexible cash, but also overall capacity to make sure that there was value in participating in general. So all that background led us to propose a grant structure. We received some feedback from council in August of 22 and came back in October of 22 to confirm the 3 different grant types that we would be offering under the CCRS umbrella. The first being focused on capacity building and planning leading to capital investment. So that idea of making more grants accessible to a greater number of organizations. So the type 1 is really about the capacity building and planning through technical assistance. Type 2 is our direct capital investment. So that is much more similar to how we've done CCS grants in the past, where it's a specific tangible project that is applied for funding through type 2. And then we left the door open for type 3, which I'll speak to a little bit more. It's not necessarily the focus of the criteria tonight, which we'll talk about, but again, reflects the desire we heard in a number of different venues to be open to community-based projects that were really related to more of a partnership with city in community-based facilities. And with that confirmation of the structure in October, we also confirmed some thresholds for the overall costs of the program and where the dollars were going. 90% or almost 20 million, 19.5 million is focused on capital investments, the vast majority of which is going directly to capital investments. So again, these are our funding thresholds or targets for the program. So 16.3 million will be direct capital. And then that 3.2 million, 15% of the overall capital investments, that's geared towards direct investment in organizations through technical assistance. So again, that idea of capacity building, where all that red circle there is value for organizations. So vast majority of program dollars are going to capital and investing directly into organizations. So that is the tee up, and I get to introduce Tony, who will walk us through our application information and criteria for type 1 and type 2 grants.
Thanks, Mark. Good evening, Council. I'm Tony Townsend, Grant Senior Program Manager. I'm excited to join the city and pleased to be here. So as we shift into the new information, I want to point out that this will be our last council checkpoint on this program before we release the information for applications. Program launch will be focused on that type 1 and type 2 project that Mark was just discussing. That type 1 being that capacity building, planning and investment program with that technical assistance. We are anticipating an August launch date for that type 1, and type 2 for that direct capital investment will be more similar to what we've done in the past, to be launched in July. And then, as Mark said, he'll touch on that type 3 a little later on tonight. So for a type 1, this is really going to be focused on making these dollars more accessible to organizations, prioritizing organizations that deliver programs and services that align with our equity goals, strengthening and providing value to each organization that participates. So regardless of whether or not we're able to identify a capital investment, we really want to make sure that there's value in participating in the program in and of itself. And finally, that we're investing in these organizations for capital funding as needed and identified in the process. So what does this look like? Focusing on small to medium organizations that need that wraparound technical assistance to access capital funds. Our goal is to accept 8 to 12 organizations, but ultimately demand will lead us to what that final number is. Maybe it's 5, maybe 14. I think we're just going to let the process dictate while keeping it reasonable so that everyone is provided with that adequate level of support. Once accepted into the program, these organizations will receive that initial capacity grant. So some initial flexible cash paired with technical assistance, and that will eventually lead into capital investment for many of these organizations. So what will be required? You know, one of the things that was heard loud and clear during the engagement sessions is that the application needs to be simple and approachable to encourage participation. So we'll have outreach help spread word to organizations that we would like to apply for the program, but we want the barrier to apply to be low. So we're looking for a simple summary of the organization, size, community served, and a description of their physical space needs. So again, that technical assistance will be an important component of type 1 grants, but we want to make sure that the long-term goal is that commercial space solution that's sustainable in Boulder. The evaluation for these will be based on criteria aligned within the city's sustainability, equity, and resilience goals, demonstrated long-term commitment to the community, programs and services that are inclusive and demonstrate a commitment to serving historically marginalized communities within the city, the ability of the funding to improve organizational and facility adaptation to future climate conditions, and finally, the ability to be able to participate in that technical assistance program. So a bit of an aside here will be on that third-party technical assistance that we've been talking about. We issued an RFP on May 26th. It will be open for the next couple of weeks. So if there's any organizations that are out there and interested in this, we would love for you to apply. This will be to identify a third-party partner to provide technical assistance for type 1 organizations. We're likely seeking one firm to be the point of contact on that program, and then they will conduct an initial assessment in partnership with city staff. Of those organizations that are accepted into the program, this third party will identify the top needs that the organization selected have and connect them to services. So whether they directly provide that or they subcontract it out, it kind of remains to be determined. But essentially, this will be in the realm of things like financial planning, legal, real estate, board development, and other types of assistance that will help advance toward a capital investment or a long-term commercial space solution in Boulder. The findings of those assessments will help us inform the top technical assistance needs that are catered individually to each organization. And then lastly, we hope that this technical assistance will help just lay a foundation for determining the most successful potential solution for that long-term space challenge. That may or may not be a capital investment with city dollars, and that's okay. We still think that there's a lot of value in this program for all of the organizations to go through the process. Our targeted timeline for this type 1, we have a little bit more lead up time while we get the third-party technical assistance partner on board. We still have some outreach to do, which will be really important ahead of releasing the opportunity for applications. We're targeting an August release date for application, and then we'll leave a good period of time open so that way we can do more outreach, we can walk people through the application process as needed. And then the evaluation and decisions on the program, participants and capacity grants will be end of December, early December timeframe. And then technical assistance assessments, hopefully beginning by the end of 2023, continuing throughout the end of 2024. And we will be sending out communication as we finalize the dates for these programs. So we'll shift over now to talk about those type 2 grants, which will require less explanation since it is similar to what we've done in the past. Next. So these are for that specific capital project for long-term investment within the city. The goal for this is that they support community-focused programs and services that are aligned with the city's equity goals, and that they're designed to deliver city resources in a timely manner. So this is really getting at that. What we don't want to see happen is having grants that are awarded and then sitting out there that have like a match requirement for another 4 or 5 years. We really want to be able to invest those dollars in real projects. So what does that mean? Type 2 projects are meant for more shovel-ready, can be executed in that short time frame. They should generally be well-defined, specific, without the need for additional planning or technical assistance. We don't exactly know when that cycle or like what that cycle will be, but we're thinking it'll be about every 2 years that we would release another RFP announcement for it. And again, this will just depend on demand. So the grant sizes of this will vary also, but we want to make sure that we have enough resources to support both type 1 and type 2 grants and to be able to do this on a cyclical basis. We don't believe that these awards will exceed $2 million, but for anything larger than $1 million, we will require just generally greater requirements that we will discuss in a little bit here. So general information on these type 2, again, we don't want that bar to be too high for organizations to apply, but since these are focused on more of an eminent investment, there will be more information requested on these applications. So in addition to some of those basics, we'll also want some simple financial statements so that we can understand the financial position of the organization and their ability to execute on the proposed investment. Our evaluation criteria will look similar, a few extra things that will be related to the organization's ability to execute within a reasonable time frame. We'll also consider the number of organizations that are in a type 2 bracket who are competing against each other for matching dollars or capital campaigns in similar areas. And then this is just important to reinforce what we talked about with those type 1 organizations is that they will be prioritized for type 2 capital funding in the future, and that some of these criteria might be waived after going through the process and being recommended for capital investment. So talking about those larger awards will come a greater amount of scrutiny. So we want to make sure that their on-hand resources are adequate to support an initial project planning and development. The city funding should generally be one of the last investments within that capital stack, especially for larger projects that the city is essentially, we want to be the last piece that's able to come in and make that project move forward, as opposed to being the base funding where, you know, there's years of planning in order to raise funds before that project can be executed. We want to make sure there's a coherent funding strategy. So if one of the last pieces is the city dollars and you need to raise, like, let's say $1 million, we want to see that funding strategy within their application. And lastly, we want to make sure that there's a commitment to any matching dollars in a shorter period of time. For a type 2 timeline, we're looking at a shorter period of time. So we're optimistic that we can release the funding opportunity by the end of July. Applications will be due by mid-September, and then ideally we're making awards in October. Again, these are targets, and we will definitely be making sure to advertise these dates once we have them finalized. And I'll go ahead and pass it back to Mark, and he's going to talk about additional program information. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. All right, a few last pieces, and then we'll open it up for questions. Tony alluded to how we will evaluate grant applications. Our plan is to establish a grant review committee that will be comprised of city staff, our third-party technical assistance partner, and then we'll be seeking some outside assistance to fill out that group to make sure that it's balanced, including an external participant with direct nonprofit management experience, obviously somebody that's not applying for grant funds, but could help us from that side of things. And then we do plan to engage with community connectors and residents or outreach to our broader community connector network to see if there is at least one participant that could help us evaluate grant applications. This review committee is responsible for making final funding award determinations. Again, this is something we discussed back in October to help address some of the things that we had heard in feedback from the last few CCS processes in helping with a smoother final award process. And just to say out loud that we will be certainly over communicating those awards to community and to council at the proper time, probably staggered a little bit depending on if it's a type 1 or type 2. Program evaluation is really important. Again, we touched on this back in October, but since we're doing something different, we want to make sure that we're evaluating this continuously and making changes whenever it looks like we're not meeting our goals. So first piece of that is establishing what our goals are and how we intend to measure. That measurement piece, being in alignment with our racial equity instrument is really important, meaning that we will be looking at, to the extent possible, where we are seeing benefit and burden across all of the investments we've made in type 1 and type 2 grants. And if there's any opportunity to make tweaks to the program, we will do so. That'll be a part of the report and recommendations that we will bring back to council at the right time to evaluate how type 1 and type 2 grants went the first time around. And lastly, we'd love to be able to do this in-house, but we think some third-party assistance will be necessary. We have included that in the RFP for technical assistance. That partner could help us potentially. There's also potential for an academic partner to help us with the evaluation. So we're looking at some options there. And then the last piece are type 3 grants. So again, we're not focused on criteria for grant 3. We're not officially opening applications for type 3, but type 3 grants were specifically aimed at feasibility studies related to concepts that might be in partnership with the city related to a specific type of use. So the feasibility is really about, does this gap exist in the community? And if so, how might we go about addressing that gap in service, specifically related to more of a community gathering space? So essentially what we're highlighting here is that we're leaving the door open. And so if there is some type of interesting or emerging opportunity that comes out of applications or comes out of other conversations, that we have the ability to tap into this type 3. It could lead us down to a path on interesting financing models. Maybe it's not just city dollars. Maybe there's other city resources. Maybe there's partnership. Maybe there's establishing some type of other trust or other financial arrangement that leverages city dollars. So we think by leaving this door cracked, if you will, we can respond a little bit more nimbly for emerging opportunities that come into this space. So stay tuned on that. I think the application process for type 1 and 2 will help inform what might be possible within this realm. And we'll make sure to hold back an adequate amount of resources to help support type 3s that may emerge through our process. And with that, we are done with our presentation and happy to invite questions.
Thank you so much. I imagine we have some more questions here. Let's see, Bob, it looks like you're first.
Thanks, Nicole. First of all, Tony, welcome to the city. You found a great place to work, and I hope you're happy with us.
Thank you.
It's always great handing out money. The question for Tony or Mark, I know that we structured this with an ability for the city to borrow against future tax collections, so that we wouldn't have to pay as we go, that we could borrow money and then repay it with tax collections, so we wouldn't have to wait for all the collections to happen. And I know that you said that for the up to 10% portion, it would result in about $1.5 million a year, or about $22 million over the life of the tax. Do you guys have a kind of a preliminary estimate of how much you might disperse in maybe this year and next year for type 1 and type 2? I recognize the fact also that we've collected this tax now for a year and a half, so we got a little bit of money in the kitty. But are you going to front end load this, or is this going to be kind of limited to roughly $1.5 million a year over the next 15 years?
Thanks for the question, Bob. It's a good one. What we plan to do is let demand drive how we end up structuring the financing. Obviously, if we're up against our full 10% allotment, that would be a conversation we would have with council. But let's say we're above that $1.5 million threshold annually, especially within this first cycle, given that there's probably some pent up demand for the support. We do intend to tap into our CCRS fund as a whole, knowing that our limit is that 10% over the life of the tax, not just the 10% annually. So you're right, we do have some saved up. We have about $2.7 million appropriated for 2023 for the program. If we do need additional dollars, we'll plan to look at the adjustment to base in November, December to help supplement, but we have adequate appropriation within CCRS fund to support that for this year, and early in the next year, we'll be budgeting appropriately for the 2024 budget as well.
Great, thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Bob. Matt.
Hey, Nicole, my question kind of, I guess, naturally follows Bob's. And I know that type 2 has that sort of limit of not wanting to exceed the 2 million, and type 3 is there to kind of be the catch-all for everything else. But my question really centers around those irresistibly large projects that I think that I'm pretty sure are out there, to be frank. And I would just hate for us to be capping off opportunity where someone says, look, $5 million from the city and we've got, you know, a state leading performing arts complex, right? I mean, something like that where you go, oh, we really can't say no, but then have we maybe capped ourselves off based on this? So that's why I want to know that there's flexibility, that if just something that is irresistible, that just really strikes the community as a must have, that we have the ability that this can meet that at any sort of magnitude within reason and not really just sort of capped it to. So I just want to know that there's an ability for those people to feel that they could submit a proposal and could look for us to creatively invest in those things and not be sort of capped off. So that's really kind of where my question centers is. How big can we go and let the community know that that's available? Whether we say yes or no is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Also a good question. We talked a little bit about this in October, which is why we didn't come forward with a hard cap. So to your point, we do want to invite all proposals. We do want to understand what the demand is for grant funding. So our threshold of 2 million was just to estimate that if we wanted to preserve a few cycles of these grants over the 15 years, at some point we do have to think about what our maximum award is. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it, I don't know until we see the full grant applications come in. I think it's fair to say that if we issued a significant grant, let's say $5 to $10 million, at some point there are trade-offs to that and how far we can extend the tax dollars. So that's why we're trying to put some language in there around some parameters, but leave the door open that certainly if demand is saying, we only have 5 organizations that are in type 1, we have a couple smaller capital projects, and there's this larger one that we could leave the door open and consider that through the process.
Thank you. Does anybody else have questions? I've got a few, but want to make sure everyone else can get them in. Okay. I will ask my questions. So you talked a little bit, Mark, about the collaborative aspect of the type 1 grants and, hoping to kind of cultivate some collaborations and things. Is there an opportunity for groups that might need to, or maybe open to pooling their type 1 resources to collaborate at that stage of the technical assistance? Or are you thinking more that people will meet each other in the type 1 phase and collaborations will kind of grow from there so that they would be collaborating on larger kind of capital grants?
Yes, good question. I think it will be interesting to see who ultimately applies. That'll be a driver in where we might have partnership opportunities. I think our hope is to create a space where those synergies, those partnerships could develop. An example that we talked about during our focus groups with some of the nonprofit organizations were, what if 3 or 4 of us want to partner on a particular space? Maybe we're all renting a space now and we want to own a building. I think that is a really exciting opportunity that could come out of the type 1. And then the focus of the technical assistance is with that group of organizations that are interested in that and getting them ready for that type of investment. And you can imagine all the lead up to that between organizational development and financial planning and eventually real estate transaction, which again, the city would be there to support as well. But I think that we hope would be a nice space for that to happen. It'll depend on the organizations that end up applying and where they're at in their journey. But I think that would be a really interesting outcome.
Yeah, I completely agree. So people wouldn't necessarily join on a type 1 application, but they may build collaborative relationships, those who are successful with their type 1 applications that might then lead to collaborations later.
Yes, and I think it's also important to note here that we'll need to do outreach directly to organizations before the application closes, because I think it's easier to explain than it is to write on a sheet of paper, as we've learned. So we'll be doing that outreach, working with our communication engagement folks and our community connectors, the organizations that we've already worked with to help support that outreach prior to the closing of that type 1 opportunity.
Thank you. And then my next question, this is sort of a few questions together, but I think you'll understand the flavor of what I'm trying to get at. Can nonprofits have addresses that are outside of Boulder, like in the mountain communities or elsewhere in Boulder County, if they're doing most of their work in Boulder? And if so, do you just sort of have a percentage in mind, or will there be one as to how much of their programming needs to be Boulder based to qualify for one of these grants, and what percentage of participants need to be based in Boulder, that type of thing?
It's a good question. We struggled with that a bit, and coming up with a final answer. So similar to the way I answered Matt's question, was that we've left the door open, certainly, to consider organizations that don't have a current physical address in Boulder. I think that's with several caveats. One is that we want to make sure that this is supporting organizations that serve Boulder residents. That's in the ballot language. And two, I think it is important, given it's an infrastructure tax, that it's supporting Boulder infrastructure. And so we have talked about the nonprofit network being infrastructure in and of itself. I think that's an important point. I think we would look at organizations that want to establish a physical presence in Boulder as kind of that first priority. That would be underneath those organizations that already do have a physical presence that want to stay and serve Boulder residents. And so, again, we'll let that demand help with that calculus and see what types of organizations ultimately end up applying. But I do think if we get in the realm where we have too many that don't already have a presence, a physical presence, and serve Boulder residents, then we might get kind of in the crosshairs of what voter intent was.
Thank you. Just a couple more. These are all sort of related to some of the equity considerations that we'll be looking at using the racial equity instrument and things like that. Are we going to be looking at things like diversity in employees as well as in program participants and programming?
That's a good question. We hadn't contemplated that specifically. Again, we were trying to make the application process a low bar. However, some of the back and forth with organizations through the application process could invite some of those questions. I think our initial focus was on who are you serving in the community, but that doesn't prevent us necessarily for asking for some more specifics from the organizations themselves.
Thank you. And then just one last question. Thanks for indulging me, colleagues. Is the application going to be available in other languages than English? And if not, can any of the technical assistance be used to help facilitate translation if anybody would need it?
We can certainly do that with the applications in terms of having multiple languages available. We haven't picked our medium yet, but that is a consideration, and making sure that this is accessible is one of our top goals. And as we hope to close out the RFP process for technical assistance in the next few weeks, that is certainly a question we will ask, is the ability to help with some of that.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any other questions before we move to feedback? All right, let's offer staff some feedback. I don't think there was a general consensus question you're asking for, just some feedback. So anybody would want to jump off with feedback? Aaron.
So nobody else is jumping in. I think you're on the right track. You know, you've come to us several times on this matter, and in previous iterations, we've given some feedback about maybe shifting in some different directions a little bit. And I think you've been very responsive to that. And I think you've got a great set of types and criteria. And I'm looking forward to seeing this program get out in the community and benefit some of our nonprofits. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Bob.
Yeah, I agree with Aaron. I think you guys have done a great job. This is probably the third or fourth time we've touched this, and we've narrowed in. And you're obviously paying attention to what we have to say and listening to us. I really, adding to what Aaron said, I really like the fact that you guys have built in a lot of flexibility here. Flexibility between types 1, 2, and 3. Flexibility on the geography question was just asked. Even flexibility on how much we're going to allocate per year. We're not limiting ourselves to the amount we collect. In good years, we may front end load some stuff, and there may be some years where we just don't see a lot of good applications. So thank you for being nimble and flexible, and obviously we'll test this over the next 2 to 3 years and adjust any areas that are not quite working. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bob. And Bob, you basically captured everything that I wanted to say. Just a giant thank you for the flexibility. I love the creativity and the enthusiasm that is sort of coming forward with this process and just trying some new things and being open to seeing what happens and making adjustments as we go. I think it's a really wonderful approach. I think it's a more equitable approach, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with all this. Any other comments? All right. Thank you, everyone. I think we are all good. Do you have what you need from us, Mark?
We do. Appreciate your time.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Does anybody else have anything they want to add on? Otherwise, we can have an extra 16 minutes in our evening. All right. Let's do it then. With no other items on tonight's agenda, I will close this meeting at 8:14 p.m.